I need a wife in name only. You'll have your own room, your own life, and I'll have mine. We don't owe each other anything beyond that." Hannah Brooks set down her single-worn travel bag, looked the tall, hard-faced rancher directly in the eyes, and said something he clearly hadn't expected. "Good, because I didn't come here looking for love either." Cole Harper blinked, just once, then turned and walked back into the house without another word. And that was how the most important marriage in Cole Harper's life began, with absolutely no expectations and absolutely no idea what was coming. If this story is already pulling you in, please subscribe to our channel and follow along all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I genuinely want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The letter from the matrimonial agency had been sitting on Cole Harper's desk for 3 weeks before he finally signed it. He hadn't wanted to sign it. He'd told himself a dozen times he didn't need to sign it. He was 30 years old, not ancient. His ranch was profitable. His hands respected him. His cattle were healthy. By every measure that mattered in Wyoming territory in the summer of 1888, Cole Harper was a man who had things under control. Except he didn't. And he knew it. The household books had fallen behind by 4 months. The dry goods orders were consistently short. 2 of his best ranch hands had quit in the spring, not because of the wages, but because the living conditions at the bunkhouse had deteriorated so badly over the winter that a man couldn't sleep without waking up with a chill in his bones. Cole had fixed the cattle fencing before he fixed the stove. He'd prioritized the grazing rotation before he prioritized the food stores. He always prioritized the ranch. That had always been enough. Until now. His neighbor old Pete Alderman had said it plainly one evening over a shared bottle of rye. "Cole, you need someone to run the house, not a hired girl, a proper manager, someone with authority and sense. Your ranch is healthy and your home is dying, and sooner or later one affects the other." Cole hadn't argued. He hadn't had the energy to argue. He signed the letter. The agency had been straightforward in their response. They presented 3 candidates. Cole had read exactly 1 profile before he stopped. Not because the first candidate was remarkable, because reading all 3 felt like too much hope, and Cole Harper had trained himself very carefully over 5 years, not to hope for things that had no guarantee of delivering. He wrote back to the agency, "Send me Hannah Brooks. If she agrees to the terms, have her on the westbound stage by the end of the month." The terms were simple. He'd put them in writing without embarrassment. He'd learned that written terms avoided future confusion, and confusion was something he absolutely could not afford. "This arrangement is practical in nature. Mrs. Brooks will manage the Harper Ranch household, including food stores, staff, welfare, household accounts, and domestic supplies. She will be provided a private room, full board, appropriate clothing allowance, and a monthly wage held in her name at the Coldwater Bend Bank. There will be no expectation of romantic or physical affection. The legal arrangement of marriage is required for respectability in the community and to ensure Mrs. Brooks's social standing and legal protection. Beyond that, we are partners in function only." He'd read it back to himself once, then sealed the envelope before he could change his mind. Hannah Brooks read the terms 4 times. The first time she felt the sting of it. Not because she'd expected poetry, but because seeing it written out so plainly, no romantic or physical affection, practical in nature, made her feel briefly like a piece of furniture being ordered from a catalog. The second time she read it, she thought about her alternatives. There weren't many. Her father, Raymond Brooks, had died 8 months ago. Consumption. Slow and terrible and final. He'd left behind 3 things: a daughter who loved him deeply, a modest collection of books she'd carried with her ever since, and a pile of debts that his business partner, a man named Arthur Finch, had wasted no time turning into a legal weapon. Arthur had been friendly as a business partner. As a creditor, he was methodical and cold. And within 60 days of Raymond's death, the house was gone. The savings were gone, and Hannah was boarding with a pastor's family in exchange for teaching the younger children their letters. She was 25. She was educated. She was capable of harder work than most men she'd ever met, and she had exactly 2 options. The first was to accept a proposal from David Mercer, who was 47, had already buried 2 wives and looked at Hannah the way a man looks at a solution to a problem rather than a person he respects. The second was Cole Harper's letter. The third time she read the terms, she stopped feeling the sting. The fourth time she picked up her pen and wrote back, "Mr. Harper, your terms are acceptable. I have my own conditions. I require full authority over household decisions without requiring your approval for purchases below $10. I require that any ranch hands in my charge be treated with basic dignity. And I require that if either of us wishes to end this arrangement, we discuss it plainly and honestly, rather than through lawyers. If these conditions are acceptable, I will be on the westbound stage." She sealed the letter before she could second-guess herself. Cole's reply came in 5 days. Agreed to all 3 conditions. Stage arrives. Coldwater Bend on the 14th. No pleasantries. No welcome. No attempt at warmth. Hannah packed her single bag, said goodbye to the pastor's family, and climbed onto the westbound stage with a calm that surprised even herself. She was not calm because she felt no fear. She was calm because she'd already made the decision, and she'd learned long ago that fear after a decision is simply wasted energy. Her father had taught her that. Her father had also taught her how to keep accounts, how to negotiate suppliers down from their opening price, and how to read a contract for the paragraph that would eventually cause trouble. She spent the 2-day stage ride doing what she always did when she was anxious. She read. She'd brought 3 books. She finished one and started the second. Coldwater Bend was smaller than she'd expected. Not poor, there was money here, she could tell from the quality of the storefronts and the condition of the road, but compact and self-contained in the way that frontier towns often were. Everyone knew everyone. Everyone was watching. She felt the watching the moment she stepped off the stage. Cole Harper was waiting beside a wagon. He was taller than she'd imagined from his letter, though she wasn't sure why she'd imagined anything at all. Dark hair. A jaw that hadn't seen a razor in several days. Eyes the color of creek water in shadow, not unpleasant, just careful. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he's already decided to be neutral about. Not unkind, not welcoming, neutral. She matched his expression without trying. "Miss Brooks," he said. "Mr. Harper." He picked up her bag without asking and put it in the wagon. She climbed up without waiting for help. He noticed that. She noticed him noticing. They rode in silence for the first 10 minutes. The road was dry and rutted, and the afternoon heat sat on everything like a lid. Eventually Cole spoke. "The ranch house has 7 rooms. You'll have the 2nd bedroom east wing. Door has a lock. Key's yours." "Thank you. Meals are at 6 in the morning, noon, and 6 in the evening. The ranch hands eat in the cookhouse. You'll have the main kitchen." "I understood from your letter that I'd be managing provisions for both." "That's right. Then I'll need to see both sets of accounts before I can assess what we're actually short on." Cole looked at her sideways. "We're not short. You may not be aware of it yet," she said. "Most households aren't until someone who isn't emotionally attached to the existing system looks at the numbers." He said nothing for a moment. "The accounts are in the desk in the study, 2nd drawer left side. I'll start there tonight." Another silence. Longer this time. "I told the hands you were arriving," he said finally. "Told them to treat you with respect. I appreciate that. They're good men, all of them. I'll form my own opinion," she said, respectfully. Cole Harper turned and looked at her directly for the first time. Something moved behind those creek water eyes. She couldn't identify it yet. She filed it away to identify later. Fair enough, he said. The first night at Harper Ranch. Hannah didn't sleep until well past midnight. Not from anxiety, from the accounts. She sat at the desk in the study with the household ledger open in front of her and a candle burned down almost to nothing, and what she found in those pages made her jaw tighten steadily with every passing hour. It wasn't fraud. Cole Harper was not a dishonest man. That much was immediately clear from the quality of the records he kept, regarding the cattle, the grazing leases, the equipment purchases. When it came to the operational side of his ranch, Cole was meticulous, thoughtful, and precise. But the household. The household accounts were a disaster, not a dramatic disaster. A quiet, slow, grinding disaster, the kind that happens when a capable person simply stops paying attention to a whole category of their life. The dry goods supplier was overcharging them by nearly 20% over current market rates. Nobody had renegotiated the contract in 3 years. The food stores were being restocked inefficiently, which meant waste in the summer and shortage in the winter. The ranch hand's bunkhouse was drawing supplies from the household account with no separate tracking, which meant nobody actually knew what anything cost. And underneath all of it, a simple, damaging fact. There were 15 people dependent on this household in various ways, and the person responsible for managing it had been a rotating string of seasonal hired girls who'd each lasted less than 4 months. Hannah closed the ledger at midnight. She sat in the dark for a moment with her hands flat on the cover. Then she opened her own small notebook, the one she'd carried since her father first taught her how to track numbers, and she began writing. She was up before Cole the next morning. When he came into the kitchen at 10 minutes to 6, she was already there, a cup of coffee in front of her and a list in her hand. He stopped in the doorway. "Morning," she said without looking up. "There's coffee on the stove. Also, I need to speak with you before you ride out." He poured a cup and leaned against the counter. "Speak. Your dry goods contract with Harmon Supply hasn't been renegotiated since 1885. You're currently paying 18 cents per pound for flour. The market rate is 14. Over a year on your current consumption, that's approximately $40 wasted." Cole was quiet. "Your bunkhouse draws from the household account with no separation. I can't tell you what your actual household costs are because half the entries are commingled with ranch operational expenses. I need to separate them before I can give you an accurate picture." "How long will that take?" "A week, maybe 10 days. I'll also need to speak with whoever's been handling the supply orders." That'd be Tommy Greer, young hand. Volunteered to do it when the last girl left. Cole paused. "He's not good with numbers." "I'm not criticizing him. I'm just saying I need to speak with him so I understand how the current system works before I change it." Cole wrapped his hands around his mug. "You found all this in one night. The obvious parts, there's more underneath. But I wanted to tell you the obvious parts first so you know I'm not exaggerating." I was quiet for a long moment. She waited. She was good at waiting. "Do what you need to do," he said finally. "You have my authority." "On purchases below $10 per hour agreement," she said. "On anything above, I'll bring it to you first. I won't spend your money without telling you." Something shifted in his expression. Not softening exactly. More like recalibration. Like he was updating the picture he'd built of her from her letter and replacing it with the actual person sitting at his kitchen table at 6 in the morning with a list. "I appreciate that," he said. "I'm not doing it for appreciation. I'm doing it because it's correct." He almost smiled. She saw the corner of his mouth move before he caught it. He set down his mug and picked up his hat from the hook beside the door. "There's a widow woman in town," he said. "Name's Clara Holt. Lost her husband 2 winters ago. She's had a hard time of it. Some of the hands help when they can, but—" He stopped, looked briefly uncomfortable like he hadn't planned to say that and wasn't sure why he had. "I'll call on her," Hannah said. He nodded, settled his hat on his head, walked out. Hannah poured herself a second cup of coffee and looked at her list. At the very bottom, she'd written a single word that she hadn't said aloud yet. Bunkhouse. She picked up her pen and underlined it. The bunkhouse was worse than the accounts had suggested. She knew it the moment she walked through the door with Tommy Greer trailing behind her, already apologizing in advance for things she hadn't even seen yet. "Mrs. Harper, I want you to know we've done our best, but with the budget we had. I'm not here to find fault, Tommy. I'm here to find out what's actually needed. There's a difference." He blinked. He was maybe 19 with freckles and ears that stuck out slightly, and the look of a young man who had been blamed for things that weren't entirely his fault, so many times that he'd started flinching before the criticism even arrived. She made a note of that too. The stove in the bunkhouse had a crack in the firebox that had clearly been there for months. Two of the sleeping bunks had frames so worn they were functionally unusable. The blankets were thin, and several had been mended so many times they were more patches than original cloth. "How many men sleep here?" she asked. "8 regular, more during roundup." "And this stove has been like this since when?" Tommy hesitated. "Since last fall, I think. Before my time on supplies. I ordered a new part back in March, and they sent the wrong one, and then I forgot to reorder, and then—" "Tommy." "Yes, ma'am. Write down every part this bunkhouse needs. Everything. Don't leave anything out because you think it's too expensive. Write it down and bring it to me by end of day." He stared at her. "You're going to fix all of it. I'm going to know what all of it costs. Then I'll prioritize. But I can't prioritize what I don't know about." He nodded slowly. Then quietly, like he wasn't sure he should say it, "The last 3 women who came through here, they never came near the bunkhouse." "I'm not them," Hannah said. She said it simply without emphasis. But Tommy Greer looked at her for a moment, with something in his expression that she recognized from a long time ago. The look of a person who has been unseen for so long. They're startled when someone simply turns and looks directly at them. She moved on to the supply inventory. By the end of the first week, she had renegotiated the Harmon supply contract. The man who Gerald Harmon had been polite when she introduced herself, and openly skeptical when she set the new rates in front of him on paper. "Mrs. Harper," he said carefully, "these prices are current market rates. I have 3 comparable quotes from suppliers in Cheyenne, if you'd like to see them." He had not expected 3 comparable quotes. "Your husband has been a loyal customer, which is exactly why he deserves fair pricing. Loyalty should benefit both parties. Mr. Harmon, not just the one holding the pen." Gerald Harmon had been in business for 22 years and was not accustomed to ranch wives sitting across his desk with competitor quotes and a steady gaze. He agreed to the revised contract. Hannah thanked him pleasantly, shook his hand, and walked out. She didn't let herself smile until she was half a block down the street. Cole came home that evening to find 3 ranch hands sitting at the kitchen table, not the cookhouse table, the kitchen table with tin cups of coffee in front of them, and a slate board on the wall with letters written on it. He stopped in his doorway. Hannah was at the head of the table. She looked up without any sign of concern about his expression, which he realized was probably more confused than he intended. "Evening," she said. "We're finishing up. 15 more minutes." "What?" He stopped, looked at the slate board, looked at the men. Billy Tate, 32, had worked the ranch for 4 years and was one of Cole's best hands with a rope. Right now, he was holding a piece of chalk and very carefully copying the letter E. "What is this?" "Billy and Pete and Hector can't read," Hannah said. Simply, directly, the same way she said everything. "They asked if I'd be willing to teach them. I said yes." "They asked, well." She tilted her head slightly. "I may have mentioned that I used to teach children their letters, and that I'd be happy to help anyone who was interested. Then they asked." Billy Tate did not look up from the letter E, but his ears had gone red, and Cole could tell the man was both embarrassed and determined in equal measure. Cole looked at his kitchen, at the coffee cups and the slate board, and the 3 men sitting at his table at 7 in the evening, learning how to read. 15 minutes, he said, and walked back out. He sat on the porch for a while in the dark. He told himself he was reviewing the fence line schedule in his head. He told himself that was why he was sitting there instead of going to bed, which was what he normally did at this hour. What he was actually doing was listening to the sound of Hannah's voice through the open window. She was patient. He hadn't expected that. Not cold, not distant, the way someone following through on an obligation might be, but genuinely quietly patient. She corrected without embarrassing. She encouraged without condescending. She spoke to Billy Tate and Pete Morales and Hector Cruz, the same way she'd spoken to Gerald Harmon, and the same way she'd spoken to Cole himself, like they were capable people whose time and intelligence she respected. He hadn't met many people who spoke to everyone the same way. Most people calibrated. Most people spoke differently to a rancher than to a hired hand, differently to a bank manager than to a widow, differently to someone useful than to someone struggling. Hannah didn't calibrate. He found that unsettling, in a way that had nothing to do with discomfort. He sat on the porch until the voices inside went quiet and the lamp in the kitchen went dark. Then he stayed a little longer. Ciao. 12 days in. She knocked on his study door after supper with a full written account in her hand and set it on his desk. Here's where we actually are, she said. Household cost, bunkhouse cost overlap with operational expense, and a projection for the next 6 months if we implement the changes I've outlined. Cole looked at the pages. They were dense with numbers and tidy handwriting and small notations in the margins where she'd flagged questions or assumptions. You did all this in 12 days. It would have been 10, but the supply invoices from February were misfiled. He read through the summary page, looked up at her. You're projecting we'll save nearly $200 by the end of the year. $230 if the Harmon contract holds and the bunkhouse repairs hold down turnover. Hold down turnover, he repeated. Men don't leave ranches that treat them well. Every time you lose a hand and train a new one, you lose approximately 3 weeks of full productivity. If fixing a stove and replacing some blankets keeps your 2 best ropers through next roundup season, it's not charity, it's business. He looked at her for a long moment. You're good at this, he said. It came out bluntly without embellishment the way he said most things. She didn't deflect, didn't brush it off with false modesty, just said, yes I am. And then because she was Hannah. The question you haven't asked yet is why a woman who can do all of this answered a matrimonial agency advertisement. Cole said nothing, but he didn't look away. My father died. His business partner moved faster than the law required. I had nothing and 2 options, and the other option was a man I didn't trust. She said it without self-pity, without drama. Your letter was honest. You told me exactly what you wanted and exactly what you'd offer. I respected that. Even though it's not, he stopped, not what a woman is supposed to want. She almost smiled. Mr. Harper, I grew up watching my father treat my mother like a partner, like an equal. I don't think highly of arrangements that are built on pretense. At least yours is honest. He was quiet for a moment. My wife, my first wife, her name was Eleanor. He said it carefully, like he was checking whether it still hurt before he let anyone else hear it. She died 5 years ago, her and the baby. Hannah didn't reach for comfort words, didn't fill the silence with reassurance. She just looked at him steadily and said, I'm sorry. 2 words, no performance, just the actual thing. Cole Harper nodded once. He picked up the financial summary and began reading it in earnest. And for the first time in 5 years, the study didn't feel quite so large and quite so empty. 3 weeks in Mrs. Clara Holt brought a pie to the ranch. She appeared at the kitchen door on a Wednesday afternoon with a dried apple pie in her arms and the expression of someone who has been dared by their own loneliness to do something brave. I heard you'd settled in, she said when Hannah answered. I wanted to bring something. Come in, Hannah said, and meant it. They sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours. Clara's husband had died of a riding accident. She had 2 children, both under 10. She had a small parcel of land, but no man to work it effectively, and no money to hire help. She was surviving, but just. Hannah listened to all of it without once making Clara feel pitied. Then she said, Do you sew? I do, well even. I'm going to need help hemming curtains for the East rooms next week. I'll pay fair wages, and if you want to bring the children, there's room for them to play in the yard. Clara Holt blinked several times rapidly. You'd do that? Clara. Hannah said it gently. I've been in a position where I needed someone to simply open a door. I know what that feels like. Please come next week. When Clara left, Hannah stood in the kitchen doorway and watched her walk back down the road. She was thinking about her father, about the way he'd always said that the most radical thing you could do in a hard world was to treat people like they mattered. She turned back to the kitchen. Behind her, she heard Cole's boots on the step. She hadn't known he was there. She'll come back, he said from the doorway. I know, Hannah said. A pause. That was kind, he said, like he was weighing the word carefully before he used it. Hannah turned and looked at him. It was practical, she said. I need someone who sews well. She sews well, and she needs the income. She let a small beat pass. Both things can be true at the same time. Cole looked at her for a moment. Then he turned and picked up his hat. Supper at 6, he said. It'll be ready, she said. He walked out. Hannah looked at the door for a moment after it closed. She was not, she told herself firmly, noticing anything about the way Cole Harper looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching. She was absolutely not noticing that. She went back to the curtains. The curtains went up on a Thursday. It was such a small thing, Hannah knew that. 4 panels of washed cotton, hemmed straight and hung clean on the east wing windows that had been bare since before she arrived. Clara Holt had sat at the kitchen table for 3 afternoons in a row, with her 2 children playing in the yard, sewing with the kind of focused quiet that belongs to a woman who is grateful and doesn't quite know how to say it out loud. When the last panel went up, Clara stood back and looked at them for a long moment. Makes the whole room different, she said. It's just fabric, Hannah said. No. Clara shook her head. It's not. Hannah didn't argue. She paid Clara her wages full rate, not the reduced rate Clara had tried to negotiate down to, and walked her to the door. After Clara left, Hannah stood in the east wing hallway and looked at the curtains herself. She thought about the accounts she'd balanced that morning, and the bunkhouse stove that had finally been repaired, and the 3 new hands Cole had hired for the summer who'd arrived to find actual blankets on their bunks, and a stove that worked. She thought about none of this being what she'd expected her life to look like at 25. Then she went back to work because that was what you did. What she didn't see, couldn't have seen from where she stood, was Cole Harper, pausing at the far end of the hall on his way in from the east pasture. He'd come through the side door, which he rarely used because a fence post had needed checking near the house. He'd stopped when he heard Clara's voice not wanting to interrupt, and he'd stopped a moment longer than was strictly necessary. He saw the curtains. He looked at them for a long time. Then he walked to the kitchen, poured himself a cup of water, and stood at the counter drinking it slowly while he thought about what Pete Alderman had said to him 8 months ago. Your ranch is healthy and your home is dying. He set down the cup. That wasn't accurate anymore. The literacy class had grown. That was the part Cole hadn't anticipated. He'd seen it start with Billy and Pete and Hector, and he'd told himself it would stay small. 3 men, quiet evenings manageable. But word moved through a ranch the way water moves through dry ground, and within 2 weeks there were 6 men at the kitchen table on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, and within a month there were 8, and one of them was Dolores Ruiz, who cooked at the boarding house in town, and walked the 1.5 miles each way, because Hannah had quietly let it be known that the class was open to anyone who wanted to come. Cole had come home to find Dolores at his kitchen table on a Wednesday evening, and stood in the doorway in complete silence for 3 full seconds. Hannah looked up at him. Dolores is joining us, she said. I can see that. She has a son in Kansas. He writes her letters. She wants to read them herself. Cole looked at Dolores Ruiz, who was 43 years old, and was gripping her chalk with the same focused ferocity as a woman who has been waiting a very long time to do this specific thing. She didn't look up at Cole. She was busy. He looked back at Hannah. He wanted to say something. He wasn't sure what. He opened his mouth and what came out was, "There's enough coffee for everyone." "I made extra when I heard you coming up the road," Hannah said. He stood there another moment. Then he poured himself a cup, sat down at the far end of the table, not close enough to intrude on the lesson, far enough to be separate, and picked up the month's supply ledger that he'd meant to review after supper. He didn't read a single line of it. He listened to Hannah teach for 1.5 hours. The letter from Arthur Finch arrived on a Friday morning in early July. Hannah recognized the handwriting on the envelope before she even turned it over. The particular precision of the letters, too precise. The way controlled people make their handwriting controlled, made her stomach tighten in a way she'd trained herself not to show. She set it on the kitchen table and stood looking at it for a full minute before she opened it. Arthur Finch was brief as he always was. He had heard she'd married. He congratulated her. He mentioned in the third paragraph that he had recently encountered questions regarding some of her father's accounts. Questions that he felt as her father's former business partner he had an obligation to raise with her directly. He would be passing through the Wyoming territory in late August and hoped she might receive him for a brief conversation. Hannah read the letter twice. Then she folded it, put it in her apron pocket, and went back to making breakfast. She told herself it was nothing. Arthur Finch was a careful, calculating man, but he had no legal claim on her anymore. She was married. She had a different name now. Whatever lever he'd been holding over her in St. Louis had lost its grip the moment she'd stepped onto the westbound stage. She told herself all of that. She didn't entirely believe it. Cole noticed something was wrong before she said a word. He came in for the noon meal and found it ready on the table, everything where it should be hot and properly made. But Hannah was standing at the window instead of sitting down, and she had the particular stillness of a person who is holding themselves very carefully in place. He sat down, picked up his fork, set it back down. "What happened?" he asked. She turned from the window. Her expression was composed. Her eyes were doing something more complicated. "I received a letter this morning from a man named Arthur Finch. He was my father's business partner. He's the one who—" She paused just briefly. "He handled my father's estate in a way I wasn't in a position to contest at the time." Cole was quiet, listening. "He's coming through Wyoming in late August. He wants to meet." "What does he want?" "He says he has questions about my father's accounts." "What does he actually want?" Hannah looked at him. Something shifted in her expression, a recognition maybe that Cole had cut directly to the question she'd been circling around all morning. "I don't know yet," she said. "But Arthur Finch doesn't travel without a purpose, and his purposes have never been to anyone's benefit except his own." Cole picked up his fork. "You don't have to see him." "I know. This ranch is your legal residence. You have no obligation." "I know," she said again, quieter this time. He looked at her directly. "But you're going to want to know what he's after." "Yes. Because not knowing is worse than knowing." She sat down across from him. "My father used to say the only thing more dangerous than a man with a bad plan is a man with a secret plan. At least a bad plan you can fight." Cole thought about that. Smart man. How was? A short pause. He trusted the wrong people sometimes, but he was very smart. They ate in silence for a while. Not the careful testing silence of the first days at Harper Ranch. This was different, more comfortable. The kind of silence two people share when they no longer need to fill every space with proof that they're being civil. Eventually Cole said, "If he comes, you tell me. I'll be here." Hannah looked at him across the table. "You don't have to. I know I don't have to," he said. The same words she'd used back at him. A small, deliberate echo. "Tell me anyway." She picked up her coffee cup, said nothing for a moment. "All right," she said. The first real argument happened over the Wilson family. The Wilsons were a family of 5 who had a homestead claim 6 miles west of the ranch boundary. The father, James Wilson, had been injured in an equipment accident in the spring and hadn't fully recovered. By midsummer, his oldest boy, who was 14, was trying to work the homestead alone. The mother had come to Hannah for help twice, and both times Hannah had sent food and supplies from the ranch stores. Cole found out on a Tuesday when Tommy Greer mentioned it in passing while going over the supply inventory. "Mrs. Harper had me pull 2 sacks of flour and a side of salt pork last week for the Wilson place," Tommy said. Cole came to find her in the garden. "Tommy tells me you've been sending supplies to the Wilson homestead," he said. Hannah kept her hands in the soil. "I have." Without telling me. She looked up at him. The purchases were under $10 each time, per our agreement. "That's not—" He stopped. Started again. "Hannah, I need to know what's going out of my stores." "You do know. It's in the supply log. I've recorded every item." "I didn't mean—" "What did you mean?" She stood up, brushed her hands on her apron. Because if you're telling me that you object to feeding a family where the father is injured, and the oldest child is 14 and trying to hold a homestead together alone, I'd like you to say that plainly. Cole's jaw tightened. I'm not saying that. Then what are you saying? I'm saying you should have told me. Why? So you could approve it, or so you'd have the opportunity to say no. So I'd know. His voice came out harder than he meant it to. So I'm not the last person on my own ranch to find out what's happening. They stood looking at each other. Hannah breathed through her nose. She recognized the feeling, the specific hot frustration of being right about the substance and wrong about the process. You're right, she said. It cost her something, but she said it. I should have told you, not because I needed permission, but because we're supposed to be running this place together, and keeping you uninformed isn't how partners operate. Cole blinked. He'd been braced for a longer fight. That's all I wanted, he said, quieter now. I'll tell you in the future. A beat. Are you going to tell me I can't help them? No. Good. She looked at him steadily. Because I wasn't going to stop. Something moved across his face that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite exasperation. It was somewhere between the two in territory he didn't have a clear name for. I know you weren't, he said. He turned and walked back toward the barn. Hannah watched him go. Her heart was beating slightly faster than usual. She told herself it was the argument. The residual irritation of a disagreement well fought. She was getting less convincing with herself every day. The night the summer storm hit, Cole was out checking the far pasture fencing and didn't get back until well past 9. Hannah had been watching the sky since 7, when the color of the clouds had turned the particular gray-green that her father had always called trouble weather. She'd moved the horses to the enclosed corral herself, with Billy Tate's help, and had pulled the east wing shutters closed and checked that the root cellar doors were latched. By the time Cole came through the door, soaked through, and looking like he'd fought the storm personally, she had dry clothes on the chair by the fire, a bowl of soup on the stove, and the particular composed expression of a woman who has been worried and is not going to say so. Cole stopped when he saw the dry clothes. He looked at them, then at her. You didn't have to. They're just clothes, she said. Sit down, the soup's hot. He changed without comment and sat at the kitchen table. She put the soup in front of him. He ate 3 spoonfuls before he said, You moved the horses. Yes. Tommy said you did it yourself when he was still coming in from the east field. The storm wasn't waiting. You could have... He stopped, tried again. You didn't need to do that alone. I wasn't alone. Billy helped. She sat down across from him with her own cup of tea. You were worried about the fencing in the north pasture. I knew you'd stay out as long as the fence needed tending. The horses needed tending too. It seemed reasonable to divide it. Cole wrapped both hands around his soup bowl. Eleanor never... He stopped. The word landed between them, and he looked briefly like he wished he could pull it back. Hannah waited. He looked up at her. She didn't like the ranch much. She tried. She was a good woman. But the work, she found it hard. That's not a criticism of her, Hannah said carefully. No, it's not. He was quiet for a moment. I've been doing this alone a long time. I forgot what it felt like to come home to someone who'd already thought of the thing you were going to worry about. Hannah looked at him across the table. The fire crackled. Outside, the rain came down hard against the shutters. My father and mother were like that, she said. They always seemed to know what the other one needed before they asked. I used to think that was just... I don't know. I thought that was just them. Something specific to them. Maybe it's not, Cole said. He said it quietly, looking at his soup bowl. Hannah didn't say anything, but her hands wrapped around her teacup tightened slightly. She sat with him at that kitchen table until the storm passed, which was well past midnight. Neither of them said much. Neither of them seemed to need to. August came in hot and dry, and with it 3 things that none of them had anticipated. The first was that James Wilson recovered faster than anyone expected, and on the first Sunday of the month, he came to the ranch personally to thank Hannah and to bring a small carved wooden box that his wife had made from the wood of their first homestead tree. He stood in the yard with his hat in his hands and tried 3 times to start a sentence and kept stopping. Hannah finally said, "You don't have to say anything, James." He nodded. Then he said it anyway. "You treated us like we mattered, when we didn't have anything to offer back. That's not easy to forget, Mrs. Harper." Hannah took the carved box and thanked him sincerely. After he left, she stood in the yard for a moment. Cole was leaning on the fence post 6 feet away where he'd been watching. "He's right, you know," Cole said. She looked over at him. "That's not easy to forget," he said. He wasn't talking about the Wilsons. She knew that. She said nothing, but she felt it land somewhere specific inside her chest and settle there, warm and slightly terrifying, and she looked back at the carved wooden box in her hands and told herself firmly, practically clearly, that she was not going to make things complicated. She was not going to make things complicated. The second thing August brought was Reverend Hooper's announcement that the church's harvest gathering would need a larger venue this year. The third thing was the letter from a man named Vincent Crow, addressed to Cole Harper-esque, inquiring in very polite and very careful language about the possibility of a private conversation regarding the water access rights on the northern boundary of Harper Ranch. Cole read it twice at his desk. Then he walked to the kitchen where Hannah was working on the harvest gathering supply list with Clara Holt and set the letter on the table in front of them. Hannah picked it up, read it. Clara looked between them. "What is it?" "I don't know yet," Cole said. He was looking at Hannah. Hannah set the letter back on the table. Her voice was very steady when she spoke. "Have you heard this name before, Vincent Crow?" "No," Cole said. She looked at the letter one more time. "I have," she said. The kitchen went quiet. Outside, the summer heat pressed against the walls. Clara Holt looked at Hannah's face and very quietly gathered her sewing and excused herself without being asked. Hannah folded the letter. "He was in St. Louis," she said. "2 years ago. He tried to—" She stopped, chose her words. "After my father died when I had no resources and no legal standing, Vincent Crow approached me with an offer. He called it a business arrangement. It wasn't." Cole's expression had gone very still. "He wanted the land my father had owned, a parcel that had water rights attached to it. He thought marrying me was the simplest way to obtain them." Her voice didn't shake, but it was doing something careful and controlled. "I refused. He made it unpleasant for a while. And then Arthur Finch sold him the land through the estate proceedings, and the problem went away." Cole stared at her. "And now he's here." "And now he's here," she said. The letter sat on the kitchen table between them. "Hannah," Cole said. His voice had dropped to something low and serious. "This ranch's northern boundary water rights, do you know what they're worth?" She looked at him directly. "I didn't," she said. "Until about 30 seconds ago." Cole picked up the letter. He stood there for a moment with it in his hand, and for the first time since Hannah had arrived at Harper Ranch, she saw something in his face that looked less like a man who'd decided to feel nothing, and more like a man who was figuring out exactly how much he had to lose. He set the letter back down. "We're not selling," he said. "I know," Hannah said, "and we're not meeting with him alone." "I know that too." Cole looked at her. A long moment, the kind that carries more weight than most conversations do. "Whatever he wants," he said, "he came to the wrong ranch." Hannah looked back at him steadily, and somewhere underneath the fear that had arrived with that letter, something else arrived, too quiet and unfamiliar and entirely inconvenient. She recognized it, though. She'd seen it in her parents. She'd seen it in Clara Holt's face when she talked about her late husband. She'd just never expected to feel it herself. Not here. Not like this. Not with a man who'd said 12 weeks ago that he needed a wife in name only. She picked up her supply list and went back to work. But her hands weren't quite steady. Cole wrote back to Vincent Crow the same evening. He kept it short. 3 sentences. He acknowledged receipt of the letter, stated that he was not currently entertaining offers regarding water rights on any portion of Harper Ranch, and wished Mr. Crow well in his future endeavors. Hannah read it over his shoulder before he sealed it. "That's it," she said. "That's it. He'll come anyway." "I know." Cole sealed the envelope. "But now when he does, he can't say I gave him an invitation." She thought about that, nodded once. "Smart. I have my moments," he said, and she heard something dry in his voice that was close to humor, and she nearly smiled, and then caught herself and went back to the kitchen. She was doing that more often, catching herself. It was becoming a full-time occupation. The letter went out on the morning stage. 5 days later, Vincent Crowe rode into Coldwater Bend in a private coach with 2 men behind him, checked into the hotel on Main Street, and began introducing himself around town as a businessman with significant investment interests in Wyoming's water future. Tommy Greer heard about it at the feed store on a Wednesday and came back to the ranch talking so fast he was nearly unintelligible. "There's a man in town, Mr. Harper, big man, well-dressed, and he was buying drinks at the saloon last night and telling anyone who'd listen that the Northern Territory water rights situation is about to change everything, and that ranchers who don't get ahead of it now are going to regret it. Hector said the man used your name specifically. Said Harper Ranch was sitting on something it didn't understand the value of." Cole listened to all of this without expression. "Thank you, Tommy," he said. Is there something we should do?" "Yes," Cole said. "Keep doing your work." Tommy looked unsatisfied with that answer, but had the sense not to say so. After he left, Cole stood in the yard for a moment with his hands at his sides. Hannah appeared in the doorway. "You heard that," he said. It wasn't a question. Every word. "He's faster than I expected. Vincent Crowe," she said quietly, "has never been slow when he wants something." She paused. "He's going to come to the ranch." "Yes. And when he does, he's going to be very charming and very reasonable, and he's going to make it sound like he's doing us a favor." "What does he actually want, Hannah? All of it. Everything you know." She came down the porch steps and stood beside him in the yard. She'd told him the surface of it the night the letter arrived, but Cole was asking for more now, and she could hear it in his voice, not suspicion, not accusation. He was asking the way a man asks when he's decided to trust someone completely and needs them to hold nothing back. She told him everything, how Vincent had first appeared 2 weeks after her father's funeral when she was still numb with grief and buried in Arthur Finch's paperwork. How he'd presented himself as a resource, a solution, a man who only wanted to help. How she'd initially believed him because she'd been 23 and exhausted and hadn't yet learned to read the gap between what polished men said and what they meant. How, when she'd finally understood what he wanted, the land specifically, the small creek parcel her father had owned that had deeded water rights attached, she'd refused, and how the refusal had turned him cold so quickly it was like watching a lamp get snuffed. How he'd worked through Arthur Finch then. Legal pressure, quiet threats. The suggestion that her father's debts might be contested in ways that would follow her professionally, socially, permanently. How she'd had exactly nothing to fight back with. And then the land was sold through the estate, and he got what he wanted, Cole said. The St. Louis parcel, yes. She looked at him steadily. But I'm starting to think that wasn't everything he wanted. Water rights in this territory are worth 10 times what they were 3 years ago. If he tracked me here, he didn't track you, Cole said. He tracked the water rights on my northern boundary. You and I living here together is either a coincidence or... He stopped. Or it isn't, Hannah said. They looked at each other. Arthur Finch, Cole said slowly. You said he's coming in late August. That's what the letter said. And now Crow arrives the same month. The silence between them had a different quality now. Heavier, more specific. They're working together, Hannah said. It wasn't a guess. That's what I think, Cole said. She breathed slowly. Then this was never just about the water rights. No, Cole said. I think this was about getting rid of you. She didn't sleep well that night. She lay in the east bedroom with the key in the lock, the way she always kept it, and stared at the ceiling and thought about Arthur Finch, who had stood at her father's graveside with his hand on her shoulder and told her he would take care of everything. She thought about the 3 months she'd spent in that pastor's house teaching children their letters, watching everything her family had built, disappear into legal proceedings she didn't have the money to contest. She thought about how thoroughly she'd believed when she stepped onto the westbound stage that she was leaving all of it behind. She got up at 4 in the morning and went to the kitchen. Cole was already there. She stopped in the doorway. He was sitting at the table with a cup of cold coffee in front of him, which meant he'd been there long enough for it to go cold, which meant he hadn't slept either. He looked up at her. "Couldn't sleep," she said. "No." She went to the stove and put on fresh coffee, sat down across from him. Neither of them spoke for a few minutes. Outside, the pre-dawn dark was complete and quiet, and the ranch was still, and it felt for a moment like the two of them were the only two people in the entire territory. "Tell me about Eleanor," Hannah said. Cole looked at her. "You don't have to," she said quickly. You've heard everything about my past. I realize I know almost nothing about yours, and right now I'd rather talk about something true than sit here being afraid." He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "She was 21 when I met her. She was from Ohio. She'd come west with her family to Homestead, and she hated it. She hated the wind and the isolation and the cold, and the fact that the nearest decent bookstore was 4 days' ride." A pause. "I loved that she hated it. I thought it was honest. I thought it was braver than pretending to love something you don't." "What happened? We married in 82. She got sick in the spring of 83. Fever. By the time we knew how bad it was..." He stopped, set down his cup. "The baby was early. She was already too weak." The kitchen was very quiet. "I blame the ranch," he said. "The isolation. The distance from decent medical care. I told myself if I'd been somewhere else, somewhere with a proper doctor, she would have lived." He looked at his hands. "I know that's not necessarily true, but I believed it for a long time. And now?" He looked up at her. "Now I think losing someone teaches you one of two things," he said. "It teaches you that loving something is too dangerous to do again. Or it teaches you that the only real loss is when you stop and realize you never let yourself love anything properly while you had it." Hannah sat very still. "Which did it teach you?" she asked. He looked at her for a long moment. "I'm still working that out," he said quietly. The coffee finished brewing. She got up and poured them both a fresh cup. When she set his down in front of him, their hands were close, not touching, but close. The way two things are when the distance between them has become deliberate. She sat back down. They drank their coffee. They didn't talk about Crow again until morning. Vincent Crow came to the ranch on a Thursday. He arrived just after the noon meal, driving his own horse alone, no men with him, which Hannah recognized immediately as a calculated choice. Coming alone said, "I'm not a threat. I'm just talking." It was the same opening move he'd used in St. Louis. She was in the yard when he rode up. She didn't go inside. She stood where she was. How was tall, well-dressed for the territory, with a face that had been constructed for making first impressions. Warm eyes, easy smile. The kind of handsome that made people trust you before they knew why. "Mrs. Harper," he said, climbing down and removing his hat. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced. My name is Vincent Crow." "I know who you are," Hannah said. Something flickered behind those warm eyes, quick and gone. "Then I'm at a disadvantage. You know me, and I confess I..." He paused, tilting his head slightly. "You look familiar. Have we met Mrs. Harper?" He was good. She had to give him that. The hesitation was perfectly timed. "Yes," she said. "St. Louis. 1886. You sat in my father's parlor and offered me a business arrangement, Mr. Crow. I declined." The warm smile held, but it tightened at the corners just slightly. "Hannah Brooks," he said. "And then, I didn't realize." "I think you did," she said pleasantly. Cole's voice came from behind her. "Mr. Crow." She hadn't heard him come out of the barn, but he was there 4 feet behind her, and the way he said Crow's name was quiet and completely without welcome. Crow looked between them. His recalibration was smooth, professional, almost invisible. "Mr. Harper, I'm glad to meet you. I've sent a letter. I received it and replied, Cole said. I thought I was fairly clear. You were, and I respect that. I'm not here to pressure anyone. I'm here because I think there's been some misinformation about what I'm actually proposing. He spread his hands open, the universal gesture of a man who has nothing to hide. This isn't a takeover. This isn't a buyout. What I'm discussing is a water access cooperative. Other ranches in the region would participate. Everyone benefits proportionally, and the water rights remain legally with their current holders. Cole said nothing. The value these rights will have in 5 years, Crow continued. When the territory population doubles, which it will, is significant. I'd hate to see Harper Ranch miss an opportunity through misunderstanding. It's not a misunderstanding, Hannah said. Crow looked at her. You're not here about a cooperative, she said. You're here because you need the Northern Creek access to make your eastern parcels viable. Without Harper Ranch's water rights, your investment portfolio in this territory is worth half what you've told your backers it's worth. She kept her voice conversational, almost gentle. I've seen this before, Mr. Crow. The structure changes. The goal doesn't. The warm smile disappeared. It didn't become hostile. It became something more dangerous than hostile. It became still. You've done your homework, Mrs. Harper, he said. I always do, she said. He looked at her for a moment, a long, assessing look, the kind that wasn't about the present conversation, but about the next one. Then he put his hat back on, nodded to Cole, and said, I hope we can speak again under better circumstances. I hope so too, Cole said. The tone made clear he didn't. Crow rode out. The moment he was out of the yard, Hannah let out a slow breath. She hadn't realized she'd been holding it. Cole came to stand beside her, watching the road. You knew about his investment portfolio, he said. I spent 2 nights with the territorial land records and the bank filings in Cheyenne that Clara's brother sent me. Cole turned to look at her. When did you? Clara's brother works at the bank. He's a clerk. I asked her to ask him to look into Crow's registered interests in the territory. She paused. I should have told you I was doing that. Yes, he said. But it wasn't a criticism. It was something quieter than that. He was looking at her with an expression she'd been seeing more often lately, the one she still didn't have a clean name for, the one that wasn't neutral. Hannah. Yes. How long have you been preparing for this? She looked at him directly. Since the day the letter arrived. He was quiet. I wasn't going to let him come here unprepared, she said. Not again. Not this time. Something moved through Cole's expression. Quick and genuine and unguarded, the kind of thing a man shows before he has time to decide whether to show it. He said, he's not going to let this go. No. He'll come at it from a different angle. Yes. And Arthur Finch arrives in 3 weeks. Yes, she said again. Cole looked down the empty road where Crow had ridden. Then we have 3 weeks to be ready, he said. The rumors started on a Monday. Hannah heard the first one from Dolores Ruiz at the Tuesday literacy class. Dolores came in quieter than usual and halfway through the lesson. She set down her chalk and looked at Hannah with the expression of someone who has been wrestling with whether to say something for the past 24 hours. People are talking, Dolores said. Hannah waited. Someone's been saying in town that your marriage isn't real, that you married Mr. Harper for his money, that he doesn't know the full story of who you are. Dolores looked uncomfortable. I don't believe it. I want you to know I don't believe it. Hannah kept her voice very steady. What exactly are they saying, Dolores? All of it. Dolores told her. All of it. The story making its way through Coldwater Bend was specific and detailed in the way that only a story with a source behind it can be. That Hannah Brooks had been a known schemer in St. Louis. That she'd targeted Cole Harper through the agency deliberately because of the land value. That the marriage was a legal arrangement with no substance behind it, which was why she kept her own room and her own accounts. That Cole was being made a fool of by a woman who would eventually strip the ranch of its value and disappear. Hannah sat with all of it for a moment. Thank you for telling me, she said. What are you going to do? I'm going to find out how far it's spread, she said. And then I'm going to deal with it. She didn't raise her voice. didn't show the specific burning fury that was moving through her chest like a lit fuse. She taught the rest of the class. She told Cole that evening. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He's trying to isolate us from the town. Yes, if the people here don't trust me, they won't stand behind us when it matters. And it's going to matter. It's going to matter very soon," she said. Cole stood up from the table, paced once, stopped. "I'll go to town tomorrow. I'll talk to people directly." "That will help," she said. "But it won't be enough. He'll keep feeding it." She paused. "Cole, there's something else." He looked at her. The story he's spreading about the marriage being a legal arrangement with no substance. She held his gaze. "It started that way. You know that. And he knows enough of the truth to wrap the lie inside it." The kitchen went very quiet. Cole said, "What are you saying?" She said it plainly, because she didn't have another way to say it. "I'm saying that if people in this town doubt this marriage, they'll doubt everything attached to it. Every account I've managed, every contract I've renegotiated, every hand I've taught, everything." She looked at him directly. "I'm saying that the one thing Vincent Crowe found to use against us is the arrangement we both walked into with our eyes open. And I don't know how we fight that without being honest about what this has become." Silence. Cole stood very still. "And what has it become?" he said. His voice was quiet, low, careful in the way that things are careful when they matter too much to be careless with. Hannah held his gaze. Outside, the wind moved through the summer dark. She had been not noticing things for 3 months now. She had been catching herself and filing things away, and telling herself firmly that she was not going to make things complicated. She had been meticulous and careful and practical, and all the things she'd told herself she was when she stepped onto the westbound stage. She was so tired of catching herself. "I think," she said slowly, "that you know what it has become." Cole didn't move. He didn't say anything, but he looked at her. Really looked at her with those creekwater eyes that had been getting less careful and less neutral every week since she arrived, and what she saw in them was not the controlled blankness of a man who felt nothing. It was the particular terrified look of a man who feels everything and doesn't know yet if he's brave enough to say so. "Cole," she said gently. "Don't," he said. Not harsh, quiet, strained. She stopped. He walked to the window, stood there with his back to her. "I can't." He stopped, started again. "If I let myself." Another stop. Hannah waited. She was good at waiting. But this waiting was the hardest kind she'd ever done. "I lost everything once," he said finally, his back still to her, his voice barely above the sound of the wind outside. "I put it all in one place, and it was all gone in a single spring, and I spent 2 years not able to get out of bed before noon." A long pause. "I know what I feel, Hannah. I've known it for a while. I've been trying not to know it because knowing it means it can be taken," she said quietly. He turned around. She was still seated at the table, both hands flat on the surface, looking at him with the steadiest expression he'd ever seen on another person. Not pushing, not demanding. Just present. Completely, entirely present in the way she always was. The way that had been undoing him since the morning she'd sat across from him with a list and told him he was overpaying for flour. "Yes," he said. "I know," she said. "I know what that feels like. I lost everything too, Cole. Different way, same hollow." She held his gaze. "But I stopped being afraid of this weeks ago. I want you to know that. Whatever happens next with Crowe, with Finch, with any of it, I'm not going anywhere. Not because of the contract, because I don't want to." The silence was enormous. Cole stood across the kitchen from her. He looked at her for a long, long moment. Then he said, "Give me a little time." It wasn't a rejection. She understood that. It was a man asking for the space to be brave at his own speed. "All right," she said. She stood up and started clearing the table. He came over after a moment and picked up the lamp to carry it to the counter. And for a moment they worked side by side in the kitchen in silence, close enough that she could have reached out and touched his arm if she wanted to. She didn't, but she wanted to. That was the cliffhanger. She went to bed with, not Crow, not Finch, not the rumors spreading through Coldwater Bend. Those she could fight. Those she had plans for. The one thing she had no plan for was the man one hallway away who had just told her he knew what he felt and who needed time to be brave and who she was fairly certain was lying awake in his room right now thinking the same thing she was. She stared at the ceiling. She almost smiled. She still couldn't sleep. Hy gave himself 3 days. That was what Cole had asked for time, and Hannah had given it to him without conditions, without pressure, without the particular kind of waiting that feels like a deadline dressed up as patience. She'd gone back to work the next morning, the same as every morning, and she'd treated him with the same directness and competence she always did, and she hadn't once looked at him like she was waiting for an answer. That more than anything was what undid him, because he spent those 3 days watching her fight. Not fighting him. Fighting for them. For the ranch, for the people on it, for everything the two of them had built in 4 months without ever agreeing to build anything together. On the first day, she went into town and called on every woman she knew. Clara Holt Dolores Ruiz, Margaret Alderman, the pastor's wife, not to defend herself, but to listen. To ask what people were saying and where it seemed to be coming from. She came back with a clear picture of the rumor's geography. It had started at the saloon and moved to the feed store, and from there into the women's circles, which was the faster and more damaging route. Crow had been strategic. He'd seeded it in the places where it would grow the fastest. On the second day, she drafted a document. Cole found her at the study desk at 11 at night with 6 pages of handwritten notes and 3 sets of bank records spread across the surface. He stood in the doorway. "What is this?" he asked. "Everything," she said without looking up. "Every account I've managed since I arrived. Every contract renegotiated. Every expense logged. Every wage paid to every hand, signed and dated." She picked up a page and set it in a separate stack. "If Arthur Finch walks into this town and tries to tell people I'm a schemer, I want every single person in Coldwater Bend to be able to hold paper that says otherwise." Cole stood there for a moment. "That's going to take you all night," he said. "Probably," she said. "Then I'll make coffee," he said. She looked up at him, then just briefly, just long enough to see what was on his face before he turned to the kitchen. She looked back down at her papers. She was smiling. She couldn't stop it, and she didn't try. He brought coffee at 11:15 and sat across from her at the desk and went through the cattle lease records while she worked through the household accounts, and they worked in parallel side by side for 4 hours without speaking, except to ask where a specific document was filed or whether a date looked right. At 3 in the morning, she set down her pen. "It's done," she said. He looked at the completed stack of documents, then at her. "Hannah," he said. "You don't have to say it tonight," she said quickly. "I know you asked for time and I'm done taking time," he said. She went quiet. Cole set down his own pen. He'd been thinking for 3 days about how to say this, and he still didn't have an elegant version, so he said the plain version, which was the only kind he was actually capable of. "When Eleanor died," he said, "I decided the safest thing was to want as little as possible, want less, lose less. I ran this ranch because the ranch didn't require me to feel anything except responsible. I answered that agency letter because a household manager didn't require me to feel anything except practical." He looked at her directly. "And then you arrived, and within 2 weeks, you were renegotiating contracts and teaching men how to read and feeding the Wilson family and sitting at my kitchen table at 3 in the morning, finishing paperwork so that nobody can take what we've built. And I can stand here and tell you that's practical, that's efficient, that's exactly what I hired you for." He paused. "Or I can tell you the truth." Hannah didn't move, didn't breathe. "The truth," she said. "The truth is, I stopped thinking of this as a business arrangement sometime around the night of the storm, when I came home to dry clothes and hot soup, and you standing there pretending you hadn't been worried." He stopped. "I've been in love with you for about 6 weeks, and I've been furious about it for most of that time, because being in love with someone means you have something to lose again." The study was very quiet. Hannah looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, 6 weeks. I've known for 8. Cole stared at her. You've been 2 weeks ahead of me this entire time, he said. I'm generally 2 weeks ahead of most people on most things, she said. You should factor that in going forward, he laughed. It came out sudden and genuine, the kind of laugh that happens before a person decides whether to laugh, and it changed his whole face, knocked years off. It knocked the careful guardedness off it, left something younger and more open in its place. She'd never heard him laugh like that. She thought she could live a very long time listening to him laugh like that. He reached across the desk and took her hand. Just that. Just his hand over hers, warm and deliberate. She turned her palm up and held on. Whatever happens with Crow, he said, and Finch and all the rest of it, I want you to know that has nothing to do with this. I'm not saying this because we're under pressure. I'm saying it because it's 3 in the morning and I'm done lying to myself. I know, she said. I know the difference. He didn't let go of her hand. They sat like that in the quiet study for a little while, with the completed documents stacked between them and the lamp burning low. And neither of them said anything else, because nothing else needed to be said yet. Arthur Finch arrived on the 23rd of August on the morning stage. Hannah knew the moment he stepped off because Billy Tate, who had taken to paying attention to things in town, since he'd learned to read the bulletin board, came riding back to the ranch at a pace that meant news. Man came in on the stage, Billy said, barely off his horse. Well-dressed. Asked at the station for directions to Harper Ranch specifically. Station master told me his name. Finch, Hannah said. Billy blinked. How'd you know? I've been expecting him, she said. Thank you, Billy. She went inside and found Cole at the breakfast table. He's here, she said. Cole set down his coffee cup. How long do we have? An hour. Maybe less if he hired a horse. Are you ready? She thought about the documents she'd spent all night completing. The land records from Clara's brother at the bank. The territorial filings she'd had pulled through the county clerk. The 3 signed witness statements she'd collected over the past 2 weeks from people in St. Louis who had seen Arthur Finch's handling of her father's estate and found it troubling enough to put in writing, which had required 2 letters, considerable patience, and the assistance of a lawyer in Cheyenne that Cole had engaged without telling her about until the replies arrived. She'd cried when she found out about the lawyer. Just for a moment. Just long enough to turn away and collect herself before turning back. I'm ready, she said. Good, he said. He stood up. So am I. Arthur Finch arrived at Harper Ranch at 9:30 with the particular confidence of a man who has never lost a negotiation he prepared for. Howe was 61, impeccably dressed with silver hair, and the kind of face that had been made for boardrooms, intelligent, composed, calibrated to project reasonableness in all circumstances. He smiled at Hannah when she opened the door and said her name, the way he always had, warm and familiar, like a man who expects warmth in return as a matter of course. Hannah, he said, it's wonderful to see you well. Mr. Finch, she said. Come in. Cole was standing in the main room when they entered. He didn't extend his hand. He just stood there looking at Arthur Finch the way a man looks at something he's already decided is a threat. Finch registered this smoothly. Mr. Harper, I appreciate you receiving me. I didn't have much choice since you arrived uninvited, Cole said. But you're here, so sit down. They sat, Finch in the chair across from the settee, where Hannah and Cole placed themselves side by side close enough that their shoulders almost touched. Finch opened pleasantly. He had concerns, he said, about the estate of Raymond Brooks. Some irregularities had come to light. He'd been working with a legal firm in St. Louis to untangle them, and as Hannah was the primary heir, there were certain documents she'd need to sign. He produced a packet of papers and set them on the table. Hannah didn't touch them. What kind of irregularities? She said. Technical issues with the original deed transfers. Nothing alarming. But the firm believes that without your signature on these clarifying documents, there could be questions raised about the legitimacy of several of the transfers that occurred after your father's death. Cole said, transfers that you executed. Finch looked at him briefly. As the estate administrator, yes. And if Hannah doesn't sign? Finch smiled. Regretful. Reasonable. then these questions might need to be resolved through the courts, which would be costly and time-consuming for everyone. There it was. The same mechanism. Different setting, same move sign, or be dragged into something expensive and exhausting until you give in. Hannah said, "May I see the documents?" He slid them across. She read every line. Cole watched her read. Finch watched them both with the patient expression of a man who has done this many times and knows how it ends. After 4 minutes, Hannah set the papers back on the table. "These documents," she said, "would confirm that a specific water rights parcel in the St. Louis County records was legitimately transferred to Vincent Crowe through my father's estate." She looked at Finch directly. "They would also close any future legal challenge to that transfer from me or my heirs." Finch's expression didn't change. "That's a fairly technical reading." "That's an accurate reading," she said. "And if I sign them, it also eliminates the last legal complication in the chain of title that Vincent Crowe needs to present to his investors to finalize his Wyoming Territory Water Cooperative." She let that land. "You and Mr. Crowe are in business together." A pause. "Hannah, that's a significant—" "We know," Cole said. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a folded document of his own. He set it on the table. "That's a sworn statement from a clerk at the Wyoming Territorial Land Office, confirming that Crowe's cooperative applications list a St. Louis LLC as a participating capital partner. The listed manager of that LLC is an Arthur W. Finch." He let Finch look at it. "So you'll understand why we find your visit today something less than coincidental." Finch was quiet for a moment, the warm reasonableness in his expression cooled by several degrees. "You've prepared for this," he said. "We have," Hannah said. "This doesn't have to be adversarial." He shifted the approach. She could see him doing it like watching a chess player change strategy mid-game. "Hannah, your father and I were partners for 19 years. I cared about him. I care about your future. If you work with us, rather than against us, there's significant financial benefit." "You used my father's death to take everything my family had," Hannah said. Her voice was very quiet, not shaking, not raised, completely steady in the way that things are steady when they've been forged in real heat. "You stood at his grave and told me you would take care of everything, and then you did. You took care of everything for yourself." The room was still. Finch said nothing. "I'm not signing your documents," she said. "And I'm going to tell you something else. Everything you've done since my father died, the estate transfers, the debt manipulation, the below-value sales. I have records. Statements. I've spent the past 3 weeks gathering them." She slid a folder across the table. "My husband's lawyer in Cheyenne has copies. The county clerk has copies. If you attempt any legal action against this ranch or against me personally, those records become the foundation of a counterclaim that will be considerably more expensive and time-consuming for you than for us." Finch looked at the folder. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. The fact that it existed was the point. "You've become formidable," he said finally. Something in his voice that might have been genuine, might have been another calculation. "I always was," she said. "I just didn't have anything to fight with before." He stood up, smoothed his jacket, picked up his document packet from the table, but not the folder Hannah had pushed toward him. He left that. "I'll convey your position to my associates," he said. "Please do," Cole said. He stood as well. "And Mr. Finch, if you or Vincent Crowe set foot on this property again without an invitation, I'll have the sheriff out here before you get off your horse." Finch nodded once, walked to the door, opened it. He stopped on the threshold without turning around. "Your father would be proud of you, Hannah," he said. "For whatever that's worth. More than you know," she said, "and less from you than from anyone else." He left. The door closed. Hannah sat very still for a moment. Cole stood beside her, close, solid, not speaking, but entirely present in the way she'd come to depend on without ever letting herself say so. Then her hands, which had been flat on her thighs throughout the entire conversation, started shaking. Just slightly. Just for a moment. Cole sat back down beside her and covered both her hands with one of his. Said nothing. Didn't try to say anything. She breathed, steadied. "That's the folder," she said. Everything we actually have on him. I know, Cole said. Is it enough? I think we won't need it. I think he's going to calculate that the cost of fighting this is higher than the cost of walking away. He paused. Crow is a different problem. Yes, she said. But not today's problem. She let out a long breath. Not today's. He was still holding her hands. She didn't move them. Crow made his next move 4 days later, and it was bolder than either of them had anticipated. He went to the bank. Not their bank, the smaller territorial savings institution, where two of Harper Ranch's supply creditors held accounts. He had a quiet conversation with the bank manager, a man named Douglas Pell, about the uncertain future of ranches that were currently under legal scrutiny. He didn't threaten. He speculated. He was very good at speculating in ways that created fear without creating liability. By the end of the week, one of the suppliers had sent a letter requesting accelerated payment on their outstanding balance. The second had quietly declined to renew the fall supply contract. Cole found out on a Friday and came home from town with a jaw so tight Hannah could see it from across the kitchen. He went to the bank, Cole said. She absorbed that. Pell told you. Pete Morales heard it from Pell's clerk at the feed store. He sat down. He's not attacking us directly. He's cutting off the supply lines. That's because he can't attack us directly. Hannah was already pulling out the supply ledger. He knows the land records won't hold. Finch has gone quiet, which means they've calculated the legal exposure. So now he's trying to make the ranch unsustainable without a fight. She opened to the current supply page. Who are we actually dependent on? Harmon's for dry goods, but that contract's solid, you renegotiated it. And the two who are pulling back. Morrison's Salt and Cheyenne Feed Cooperative. She thought for a moment. Cheyenne Feed has 3 competitors within 60 miles. Morrison's is replaceable inside a week. This hurts, but it's not fatal. She looked up. Unless he gets to Harmon's. Cole looked at her. If Harmon's pulls, then we have a real problem. She stood up. I'm going to see Gerald Harmon tomorrow morning. Hannah. We renegotiated in good faith. I'm going to remind him of that in person and find out what Crow has said to him, if anything. She was already writing a list. Cole, I need you to go to the territorial courthouse Monday. I want to know if there are any filings against this ranch in the last 30 days. Anything, even preliminary. I'll go Monday. And I need you to talk to the town council. He paused. Why the council? She looked up at him. Because this stopped being just about Harper Ranch 3 days ago. Crow isn't just threatening us. He's threatening every rancher and every small business in this territory who has water access that he wants. If we can make the town council understand that we're not fighting this alone anymore. Cole looked at her for a long moment. You've been thinking about this all week, he said. I've been thinking about it since the day you showed me that letter. She held his gaze. I told you when I arrived that I wasn't going to manage your household. I was going to manage it well. This is what well looks like when it gets hard. He stood up from the table, came around to where she was standing, and without preamble, without announcement, he put both arms around her and held her, not a romantic gesture, or not only that, but the specific embrace of a person who needs to say, I see you, and doesn't have better words for it. She stood still for just a second in surprise. Then she put her arms around him and held on. They stood there in the kitchen for a long moment, in the late afternoon quiet, and neither of them said anything, and neither of them needed to. Gerald Harmon, it turned out, had received a visit from one of Crow's men on a Thursday. He told Hannah this himself, sitting across his desk from her, with the particular expression of a man who is embarrassed by his own temptation to do the wrong thing. He suggested, Harmon said carefully, that it might be in my business interests to reconsider the terms of our contract with Harper Ranch. And what did you tell him? Hannah asked. Harmon was quiet for a moment. I told him I'd think about it. The air in the room was very still. Gerald, Hannah said, you've been supplying ranches in this territory for 22 years. You built this business through fair dealing, and you know every rancher in a 60-mile radius. If Vincent Crow gets what he's after, if he controls the water cooperative, Do you understand what that means for independent businesses in this town? Harmon said nothing. It means he controls who gets favorable terms and who doesn't. It means every contract in this territory flows through him eventually. She leaned forward. He came to you because you matter. Because if Harmon's turns against Harper Ranch, other people will follow. He's not buying your contract, Gerald. He's buying your credibility. Harmon sat back in his chair. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "He made it sound very reasonable." "He always does," she said. Another silence. "Our contract stands," Harmon said finally. "I gave you my word when I signed it." She thanked him, stood up, shook his hand. She walked out of that office and stood on the wooden sidewalk outside for exactly 10 seconds collecting herself. Then she walked to the town council building and asked to speak to whoever was available. 3 council members were in. She spent 45 minutes with them. She brought the land records, the Cheyenne filing copies, and the supply chain information. She laid it out piece by piece, clear and methodical and entirely without drama, because she'd learned from her father that panic convinces no one, but evidence convinces everyone. When she finished, the senior council member, a rancher himself, 62 years old, who had been running cattle in this territory since before it was organized, looked at her across the table and said, "What do you need from us?" She told him. The town hall meeting was called for the following Thursday. It was supposed to be an informal gathering, 20-30 people at most, the council had said. By Thursday evening, there were more than 80 people packed into the meeting hall, because word had moved through Coldwater Bend in the particular way that word moves through small communities when something touches everyone. Cole stood at the back of the room before it started and looked at the crowd. He found Hannah near the front talking quietly with James Wilson and 2 other homesteaders he recognized from the Northern Valley. She was listening to them, not talking, that specific focused listening. She did the kind that made people feel heard before she'd said a word. Billy Tate appeared beside Cole. "Place is full," Billy said. "Yes," Cole said. "Mrs. Harper did this." "Yes," Cole said again. Billy was quiet for a moment. "She's something, Mr. Harper." Cole didn't take his eyes off her. "Yes," he said for the 3rd time. But this time, it was different, not an agreement, not a confirmation. Just a man saying the truest, simplest thing he knew how to say. The meeting opened. The council chairman spoke first, laying out the water rights situation in plain terms that everyone could follow. 2 ranchers from the Northern Valley spoke about the pressure they'd already received from Crow's representatives. Gerald Harmon stood up unexpectedly and told the room that he'd been approached and had declined, and there was a murmur at that because Gerald Harmon's endorsement meant something in this town. Then Hannah stood up. She didn't have notes. She'd had them earlier in the day, but she'd set them down before she came in because she knew by now that the notes were for her own confidence and she didn't need them. She talked for 7 minutes. About her father. About Arthur Finch. About what Vincent Crow's cooperative actually meant for independent water access in the territory. She was clear and specific, and she cited numbers and dates, and she didn't once ask anyone to feel sorry for her or for Cole. She talked about what was at stake for every single person in that room. When she finished, the room was very quiet for a moment. Then James Wilson stood up. "I want to say something," he said. He was not a natural public speaker. He stood with his hat in his hands, and his voice was rough. "This woman sent food to my family when my children were hungry, and my boy was trying to work land he wasn't old enough to work alone. She didn't do it for credit. She didn't do it to buy loyalty. She did it because it was right." He looked around the room. "I'm standing with Harper Ranch, however that needs to look." And the room shifted. It was a specific physical thing. Cole felt it from the back wall, the way a room's temperature changes when the collective mood turns. 3 more people stood up behind Wilson. Then 5 more. Then a woman Cole didn't recognize from the east end of the valley who said she'd heard rumors about Mrs. Harper being a schemer and wanted to say publicly that anyone who'd spoken to her for 5 minutes knew that was a lie. Cole stood at the back of the room and felt something happening in his chest that he hadn't felt in 5 years. It felt like being part of something. It felt like home. After the meeting, When the crowd was slowly dispersing into the August night, Cole found Hannah on the steps outside. She was talking to Clara Holt, who was crying in the quiet way of someone who has been holding it in for the duration of a public meeting. He waited until Clara hugged Hannah and walked away. Hannah turned and saw him standing there. She looked for just a moment like what she was, a woman who had spent 4 months building something out of almost nothing and was only now allowing herself to see how much of it had held. He walked up the steps to where she stood. 8 weeks, he said. She looked at him. What? You said you knew 8 weeks before I said anything. I want to know, was it before or after the night of the storm? She thought about it. Genuinely thought about it for a moment. Before, she said. How long before? A week. So it was the curtains, he said. She blinked. What? You hung curtains. I came through the side door and I saw them and I thought this is what it feels like when someone makes a house yours again. He paused. And then I spent a week telling myself I was being ridiculous. Hannah looked at him. I knew, she said slowly, when you sat at the far end of the kitchen table during the literacy class and pretended to read the supply ledger. I was very still. You noticed that. I notice everything, she said. You stayed for an hour and a half and you didn't turn a single page. The corner of his mouth moved. She laughed, short and genuine and surprised out of her. And then he was smiling too, really smiling, and she thought she had never in her life seen anything quite as good as Cole Harper, smiling at her on the steps of the Coldwater Bend Meeting Hall in the warm August night, with 80 people dispersing around them who had just stood up for something because she'd asked them to. He held out his hand. She took it. Simple as that. They walked back toward the wagon together, his hand around hers, and she felt something settle in her chest that she had no word for yet, but recognized instinctively. It was the feeling of exactly where you're supposed to be. Vincent Crowe did not leave town after the meeting. Cole had half expected him to. Men like Crowe, in Cole's experience, were comfortable with resistance up to a certain point, and then they recalculated and moved on to easier targets. The town hall meeting had been a clear signal. 80 people in a room. Half of them ranchers and homesteaders with legal standing. All of them now aware of exactly what Crowe's cooperative actually meant for their water access. A reasonable man would have read that room and revised his plans. But Crowe didn't leave. He moved to a longer-term room at the hotel. He hired a local lawyer named Patterson. Not a bad lawyer. Cole knew him slightly. A careful and ambitious man who would work hard for whoever was paying him. And he filed a formal inquiry with the Territorial Land Office, questioning the chain of title on the northern boundary water rights of Harper Ranch, going back to the original 1879 deed. Cole found out on a Monday morning from his own lawyer in Cheyenne, who sent a writer with a message that said in the careful language of a man paid to be precise. The inquiry has no immediate legal force, but it creates a cloud on the title that will need to be addressed before any sale or transfer of the property. I recommend we respond formally within 30 days. Cole read the message at the breakfast table. Hannah was already reading it over his shoulder before he'd finished the second paragraph. She sat down across from him. A cloud on the title, she said. Yes. He can't win outright, so he's making the ranch harder to operate, harder to borrow against, harder to sell if we ever needed to. Yes. She looked at the message one more time. Something moved across her face, not fear, not defeat, but a very specific kind of focused anger that Cole had come to recognize. It was the look she got when she was done being patient and had started being dangerous. He's not trying to beat us, she said. He's trying to exhaust us. That's what I think. Then we can't let this drag out. She stood up. I need to send 2 letters this morning, one to Cheyenne and one to St. Louis. St. Louis. She looked at him directly. Arthur Finch left that folder I gave him on our table, which means he read it and decided the exposure was real. I want to know if he's still in business with Crowe or if he's pulled back. She paused. If Finch has pulled back, Crowe is operating without his St. Louis capital partner, which means his investor presentations have a hole in them, which means we attack the hole. Cole looked at her for a moment. You want to go after his investors, he said. I want the truth about his investors to be available to anyone who asks, she said. There's a difference. He almost smiled. Is there? Legally, she said yes. He pushed back from the table and stood up. Write your letters. I'll ride to Cheyenne Thursday and meet with the lawyer in person. Take the land deed copies, all of them going back to 1879. I know. And Cole. She stopped him before he reached the door. He turned. He picked this fight because he thought we were isolated, she said. We're not isolated anymore. Don't forget that. He looked at her standing at the kitchen table in the early morning, with her jaw set and her eyes clear, and the particular steady fire in her that had been burning at the same temperature since the day she'd arrived, and set her single bag down and looked him in the eye and matched his neutrality without flinching. I know we're not, he said. The letter from St. Louis arrived 9 days later. It wasn't from Arthur Finch. It was from the lawyer in St. Louis, who had sent the signed witness statements, a man named Cowboy, whom Hannah had contacted through a former colleague of her father's. His letter was brief and carefully worded. But what it said was this: Arthur Finch had within the past 2 weeks quietly dissolved his participation in the Wyoming Territorial LLC. The dissolution had been filed without public announcement. As of the date of the letter, Vincent Crow's cooperative application no longer had a St. Louis capital partner on record. Hannah read it standing at the kitchen counter, and then read it again sitting down. Cole came in from the yard and found her staring at the letter with an expression he couldn't immediately read. What happened? He said. She handed it to him. He read it, looked up. Finch pulled out. Yes. So Crow's investor presentation has a gap the size of his primary capital commitment, she said. Which means anyone who invested with him based on that presentation was given materially inaccurate information. She looked at Cole directly. That's not a land dispute anymore. That's fraud. The kitchen was very quiet. We need to get this to the lawyer today, Cole said. I've already written the letter, she said. I need you to write it to the Cheyenne post office personally. I don't want this on the regular stage. He picked up his hat from the hook without being asked. I'll be back by nightfall, he said. She caught his arm as he passed, held it for just a moment. Be careful, she said. He put his free hand over hers briefly. Always. He wasn't always. She knew that, and he knew she knew it, and neither of them said anything further, because sometimes the truest thing you can say is the thing you both already know. Crow found out about the Finch dissolution before Cole got back from Cheyenne. Hannah didn't know whether Finch had told him directly or whether he had his own contacts at the filing office, but she knew the moment Billy Tate came riding up to the house at 4 in the afternoon that something had shifted. Crow was at the hotel all morning, Billy said, and then around noon, Patterson the lawyer came in and they were in Crow's room for 2 hours. And when Patterson left, he looked like a man who'd been told very bad news very calmly. Hannah took that in. Is Crow still at the hotel? As of an hour ago, yes. Thank you, Billy. She sat down and thought. Crow was smart. He would already be recalculating. The Finch dissolution was a blow, but not necessarily fatal. He could find another capital partner, resubmit the filings, restart the process. What he couldn't do was restart the process in Coldwater Bend, where 80 people now knew his name and his methods. He would have to go somewhere else. He would have to cut his losses in this territory and rebuild the cooperative from a different angle in a different county, unless he did something reckless first. That was the part she was worried about. Men like Crow, in Hannah's experience, were disciplined until they weren't. Until the calculation stopped working and something more personal took over. She was still sitting with that thought when the knock came at the front door. She opened it. Vincent Crow stood on the porch, alone, no hat, which was unusual. She'd never seen him without his hat. Outdoors, and the absence of it made him look slightly less composed than usual, like something had been removed that he depended on. Mrs. Harper, he said. She didn't open the door further. Mr. Crow. I'd like to speak with you, without your husband present. That's not going to happen, Hannah. He used her first name, deliberately reaching for the old familiarity, the St. Louis parlor version of her, when she'd been grieving and broke and 23 years old. "I think if we could speak plainly to each other—" "We are speaking plainly," she said. "My answer is no. Anything you want to say to me, you can say in front of Cole, or you can say it through your lawyer in writing." His jaw tightened, just slightly. "I made mistakes," he said. "In St. Louis, with your father's estate. I know that. And I know that what I asked of you then was—" He stopped, seemed to search for the word. "Inappropriate." She looked at him. "I'm not here to reopen that," he said. "I'm here because I think we've both spent the last 3 months fighting each other when we didn't have to. I think there's still a version of this where everyone walks away with something." "There isn't," she said. "Not from me." "You're making this harder than Mr. Crow." Her voice was quiet and absolute. "You came to this territory because you thought I was the same woman you met in 1886. Alone, without resources, without legal standing, without anyone to stand beside me." She held his gaze. "I'm not that woman anymore. I'm not sure I was ever quite that woman, but I certainly am not now. Whatever version of this conversation you came here prepared to have, it doesn't exist." He looked at her for a long moment. Something changed in his expression. Not softening, but something more honest than anything she'd seen on his face in all their dealings. A kind of recognition. "No," he said quietly. "I suppose it doesn't." He put his hat back on, she hadn't even seen him take it off, and walked back down the porch steps. He didn't look back. She watched him walk down the road until she couldn't see him anymore. Then she closed the door, leaned her back against it, and let out the longest breath of her life. Cole found her there when he came through the back door 20 minutes later. She was still standing with her back against the front door, eyes closed, and he stopped in the doorway between the kitchen and the hall. "Hannah." She opened her eyes. "He came." Cole went very still. "Crow." "Yes." "Alone." "Yes." He crossed the hall in 4 steps and stopped in front of her. He looked at her face, reading it the way he'd learned to read it over 5 months, the specific language of her expressions that had no equivalent in any words. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "He didn't threaten. He tried to negotiate, and when I said no, he left." She looked up at Cole. "I think he's done." "You think?" "I think he's smart enough to know when a position is untenable. He lost Finch. He lost the town. He lost the element of surprise." She paused. "And I think some part of him knows that what he did in St. Louis was wrong, and he's been waiting for someone to simply say so to his face." Cole looked at her. "Did you?" "Yes," she said. He studied her for a moment. Then he reached out and tucked a piece of hair back from her face, a small, entirely deliberate gesture, and said, "I should have been here. I handled it. I know you handled it. I still should have been here." She put her hand flat against his chest, feeling the solidity of him, the realness of him standing in front of her after 5 months of building something together that neither of them had planned. "You were doing what needed doing," she said. "That's what we do." He put his hand over hers. "The lawyer in Cheyenne got the letter," he said. "He thinks the fraud angle is strong. He's going to file a formal response to the title inquiry and attach the Finch dissolution records. He said in his opinion, Crow will drop the inquiry within 2 weeks, rather than have the investor fraud question examined publicly." Hannah let out a slow breath. 2 weeks. "Maybe less." She nodded. Her hand was still on his chest. His hand was still over hers. "Cole," she said. "Yes." "I want to tell you something." "All right." She looked up at him. "When I answered your letter, when I read those terms, you wrote out so plainly, no romance, no affection, practical in name only. I told myself that was exactly what I needed. Simple, clear, no complications." She paused. "I was wrong." He didn't say anything. "Not about needing simplicity," she said. "I did need that, but I was wrong that simple and clear meant empty. I thought those were the same thing. They're not." She looked at him directly. "This is the most complicated thing I've ever done, and it's also the clearest I've felt about anything in my life." Cole looked at her for a long moment. Hannah Brooks, he said slowly. Harper, she said. Something moved through his face. Hannah Harper. He said it like he was weighing it, like he was deciding whether he'd earned the right to say it with everything it meant. He had. She watched him decide that he had. I asked for a wife in name only, he said, because I'd decided that names were safer than everything else, that if I kept it to a name, kept it to paper, kept it to practical, I wouldn't have anything real enough to lose. He shook his head slowly. I didn't account for you. That seems like a significant oversight, she said. The worst one of my life, he said, and the best thing that ever happened to me. She laughed and he kissed her. Not dramatic, not performed, just real warm and certain and entirely without hesitation, the way a man kisses someone when he has finished being afraid and decided with his whole self to choose them. She kissed him back exactly the same way. Vincent Crow's lawyer filed for withdrawal of the title inquiry on a Friday 11 days later. The letter from the Cheyenne lawyer arrived the same afternoon. It was 2 sentences. The inquiry has been formally withdrawn. The title is clear. Hannah read it at the kitchen table with Cole standing beside her. She set it down. She didn't cry. She sat quietly for a moment and thought about her father and about the westbound stage and about a letter that had said no romance, no affection, practical in name only. And she thought about everything that had happened between that letter and this table on this Friday afternoon in September. It's over, she said. It's over, Cole said. She looked up at him. What do we do now? He sat down across from her. The same chair he always sat in. The same table where they had negotiated contracts and worked through supply ledgers and drank coffee at 3 in the morning and argued about the Wilson family and talked about Eleanor and talked about her father and learned piece by piece the specific and irreplaceable shape of each other. Now, he said, we build what we were actually building this whole time. The harvest gathering was held in late October. It was the largest one Coldwater Bend had seen in a decade, not because of any single effort, but because of the accumulation of small ones. Clara Holt had organized the food. The literacy class students, all 11 of them, now had prepared a small presentation for the community that made Dolores Ruiz cry and made Billy Tate stand approximately 3 inches taller than his usual height. James Wilson brought his entire family, including the 14-year-old boy who had held the homestead alone through the summer, and who shook Cole's hand with the serious grip of someone who knew what it had cost. Reverend Hooper spoke. The council chairman spoke. Gerald Harmon brought his wife and 2 daughters and made a point of introducing them to Hannah with the particular warmth of a man publicly acknowledging where his loyalty stood. At the end of the evening, when most of the gathering had settled into the comfortable noise of a community feeding itself, Cole found Hannah standing slightly apart, not isolated, just having a moment of stillness inside the crowd. He came to stand beside her. Your father would have loved this, he said. She was quiet for a moment. He would have wanted to know everyone's name by the end of the night, she said. He always said the names were the most important part. He was right. She looked at him. He was right about a lot of things. She paused. He told me once when I was about 12, and convinced that being strong meant never needing anyone, he said. Hannah, the bravest thing you will ever do is let someone matter to you. She looked out at the gathering. I argued with him for about 10 years about that. What changed your mind? She looked at Cole directly. A letter, she said. And a man who thought he was hiring a household manager. I made a sound that was almost a laugh and almost something more tender than that. I want to do something, he said. She looked at him. He turned to face her fully, right there in the middle of the harvest gathering with 80 people around them and fiddle music starting up somewhere near the back wall. He took both her hands in his. I know we signed a contract, he said. I know we had terms. I know the whole thing started because I was too scared to want anything real. He held her gaze. I want to do it again. Not because the first one was wrong, but because the first one wasn't this. It wasn't me standing in front of you knowing exactly who you are and choosing you completely. He paused. I want to say the vows knowing what they mean, not as a practical arrangement, as a promise. The fiddle music was playing. People were talking and laughing all around them. Hannah looked at the man in front of her. This careful, guarded, deeply good man, who had taken 5 months to say what she'd known for 8 weeks, who sat at the far end of the table, pretending to read supply ledgers, who made coffee at 3 in the morning, without being asked who had stood in the doorway when Arthur Finch walked into his house, and said, "I didn't have much choice," with a tone that made it perfectly clear he'd chosen it absolutely. "Yes," she said. "Yes to the question I haven't technically asked yet. Yes to all the questions you're going to ask," she said. "I told you, I'm generally 2 weeks ahead." This time, when he laughed, she felt it in her own chest, warm and certain, and entirely hers. The ceremony was small. Reverend Hooper, Clara and her children, Billy and Pete and Hector and Dolores and the other students from the literacy class, James Wilson's family, Gerald Harmon and his wife, old Pete Alderman, who had told Cole 8 months ago that his home was dying, and who cried quietly into his hat for the duration of the vows and denied it afterward to anyone who asked. Cole said his vows looking directly at Hannah without notes, without rehearsed elegance, in the plain and certain voice of a man who has stopped being afraid of what he feels. Hannah said hers the same way. When Reverend Hooper pronounced them, there was a sound from the small gathered crowd that wasn't quite applause and wasn't quite just breath. It was the sound of people who had watched 2 people find their way to each other and recognized in some wordless way that they were witnessing something true. Afterward, standing in the late October afternoon with the whole valley gold and quiet around them, Cole said, "I told you the day you arrived that I needed a wife in name only." "You did," Hannah said. "I was wrong about what I needed." "You were wrong about a lot of things," she said. "Enumerated or general?" "General," she said generously. "Specific list available on request." He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and they stood there together, looking at the valley that they had built into something real, not by grand gestures or perfect circumstances, but by choosing every single day to show up for each other and for the people around them, and for the life that had turned out to be nothing like what either of them had planned, and everything that mattered. A year and a half earlier, Hannah Brooks had read a letter 4 times and picked up her pen and decided that honesty was worth more than romance. She had been right. She just hadn't known yet that honesty, given enough time and the right person, becomes the most romantic thing in the world. Cole Harper had thought he was solving a practical problem. He had been wrong about that too, and of all the mistakes he had ever made, it was the one he was most grateful for. Every morning, every evening, every ordinary and extraordinary day of the life they built together from that point forward, without reservation and without end.